And I don't want this next point to be in any way connected with that in your mind. What about crap games? Now, the thing is, as soon as we say, which does a good dessert, then it's always, it's the best. So there's the National Video Museum in Bradford, which the NBA is part of a thing called TV Heaven. And the thing we've always really wanted is to have either TV Hell or Games Hell. Because the story of games, my memory of games is spending £7.99 on some truly awful cassettes and looking at them thinking, I've got to try and ring something like this is £8 in my pocket money. And they were terrible. And week upon week upon week, I played some truly awful games. And they are a really, really big part of what games culture is. So are we going to end up with this kind of, with just the east wing of the York Minster remaining, just these celebrated, valorised things? Or should we also have, sorry, my wife is an museum curator, but I probably have read the original photos, so I shouldn't have, but we snuck in there to have a look at them. She's got to shake the Birthplace Trust. This is not, is it? I'm not going to record it right. I'll get to trouble for this time. We used to try to cancel as well. It's like the ordinary, everyday stuff is the stuff that disappears. So fantastic paintings of people in their finery are everywhere, but three-cornered stools, which you see in those paintings, which are it's a standard piece of Elizabethan furniture. Nobody cares about those, and eventually gets too cold to chop them up, chuck them on fire. So what would we, the everydayness of games, I think, is something maybe we need to think about too, because, that Miyamoto guy, I guess he'd be on most people's lists, and, was he, there's the kind of top 10 list of, games I should see when put together. I can see you're chomping at the bit. You should tell me what the crappiest game is.
I'm not going to. But I really wanted to say this, so I'm really glad you asked this question. But building on what you were saying, really, if you look at history as we encounter it in schools, is it the history of kings and queens, or is it all the other stuff? It's a perennial debate. But I think there's a really weird relationship between power and our perception of virtue. I think that historically it was always assumed that the powerful were virtuous because that's just the divine order of things. The powerful are virtuous. They're powerful because they're virtuous, or they're virtuous because they're powerful, or whatever. We don't really have that now, but for a long time that was just a given. But we do actually have that in a way. Like, a lot of people think, oh, well, obviously we need to preserve the successful games, right? Because they're good, in inverted commas. And I really think there's a connection between that and moral judgment that is kind of misleading. And very often the good is kind of really non-obvious and not correlated very well with the powerful. Sometimes they do intersect, and vice versa and so on, but it's like there's not a great correlation there, in fact, in my opinion.
Well, I think we need a more nuanced framework for crap games.
Very crap.
Well, so E.T., of course, which is the poster child for crap games, right? But huge historical impact. The story of E.T. and whatever happened to all those things being bulldozed in New Mexico is a cultural meme now, of sorts. I do know Rafer Gwyn's a historian, has gone to New Mexico, has done a whole study of what really happened to those E.T. games, right? So there's a really terrible game, by some accounts the worst game ever. And it's actually quite fruitful for historical scholarship. We get into a real conversation about what happened to the game industry in the early 1980s and all of that through that game. I'm not sure that any of the people that are doing that have actually played it, but have gone through that level of torture. But it's clearly an important game. Now, there's also games that are really bad and have never been played. I have games that I have just maybe played for 5 minutes and that was it. Or they're games that are so derivative, so you don't even remember what they were after their title after you played them, all those sorts of things. I don't know, maybe there would be some approach to those. Some of you may know there's this kind of distant reading idea of being that's circulating now in digital humanities, of being able not necessarily to read all the 19th century novels, but to do a kind of a data inquiry on the database of all the text that would enable you to get some kind of sense of what a genre novel of a certain kind was in the 19th century, you know, a Western novel or whatever it might be. So maybe there's some way that somebody would look at all the really bad games that nobody's really interested in playing through in a kind of grand sense of trends. You know, what the subjects were of those bad games over a period of time, and to be able to say something about it if they're the right tools to do that. So I don't know, it's got a lot of different things I guess you could do with them.
I think there's again, it comes back to kind of us being too close in context is, like, you know, let's not get into who decides if a game's bad or not, but the, you know, it's incredibly likely that right now, and everyone who's ever worked in professional game development has worked on a shit game. So presumably the next heroic, famous game developer who's going to change the world is currently a junior designer on some absolutely awful movie game tie-in. And we don't know about that game, we don't care about that game, we won't like that game. But when that man or woman grows into this heroic figure, this Shakespeare of video games, we're going to become very interested in that game because we're going to be looking for that genesis of that person's creativity. And when it's not going to be there if we're not careful. The guy driving the bulldozer full of ETs was not sitting there thinking, gosh, this could be really culturally significant. I'm just throwing it all away. If only some kind of construct existed by which this could be saved. That wasn't occurring. We don't know. We don't know at the point where something happens if it's important or not. And hopefully we'll, you know, the context comes later, and hopefully we have a system in place whereby when we do realise, oh God, that was really important, that tie into that movie was massive and is the starting point of something beautiful, then it will be there. That's the thing.
It strikes me, and apologies if this is kind of more of a rambling thought than a concise question, but it's struck me a few times as we've been talking that maybe what's really important here isn't necessarily the preservation of video games and the creation of video games archive, but is actually the recognition of the position of a game historian and the study of the history of games and courses around learning to become a game historian being really important. So my sister studies Native American studies in Arizona, and that's a very worthy thing to do. And I have a friend who studies the history of film, and that's a very worthy thing to do. Actually, studying the history of video games has kind of not yet reached maybe that pinnacle, and maybe that's because still there's a bit of an issue around the cultural impact of video games, which for some reason is still there, so it's still not seen. And once game history is something that people are studying at university and that people are actively going after, and you have these historians whose job is then to do exactly what we're talking about here, to collate and to document what's going on and to be right in the thick of it, then the video game archive follows naturally. And maybe it's more about coming in and attacking that and saying we need more courses on the history of games, we need more recognition, we need more government funding, whatever it be. I don't know if that's
I think that's an amazingly apt point to have come to just on the basis of our breakfast conversation here. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that's totally on point. The state of critical studies of video games, and in particular history of video games, is rather sad at the moment. We're trying to, next year there'll be an international conference in Montreal that I've been involved with organizing, and we're hoping that will be one way of sort of jump-starting things. There are very few, I have to say, this might even be a problem for the whole effort of documentation and preservation, is that there are relatively few people, whether developers or academics, who are using the archives that we have right now. There's a real tendency to just kind of grab some stuff off the web that's easy to get, play the game yourself, maybe interview a couple people, and all your source work gets done. You know, when there are archives out there for particular games that could be mined, there are certainly collections of historical games, people aren't doing it. There's no archival practice or historical research sort of practice that's developed at all. Whereas, of course, for the fields that you mentioned, I'm sure your sister, I think you said it was, she's spending a year just learning the methods to apply to the problem that she's doing. There's nothing even remotely like that for digital games, and for the most part, somebody might correct me, for most digital media, that's the case.
Oh. Yeah.
With my Chinese lectures, was this with a debate in GameCity a few years ago, and earlier this year, both classes supposed in Cardiff through doing preservation of complex objects and everything. I can't remember which event it was, but I remember someone mentioning it was Germany when games submitted to their ratings, an archive copy is kept. And it's that kind of thing. You're saying there's no sort of database set up or method for it. And it's one thing that became evident to me, again, it's more probably more rambling than it is a specific question. But it's heartbreaking to see that there is that almost system there that could be utilised. And just that slight change in the wording of copyright and all that kind of stuff to make it archivable when it goes through the normal rating systems that it has to anyway. It just seems to be there is that there that's just not being used yet. So, thoughts on that?
When Stella said perpetuity earlier, it reminded me of the Bodleian Library, which is a copyright library. So they have a lot of stuff, right? Because I get the impression that you used to. Okay, yeah. So go.
Sorry.
I didn't know that. That's really cool.
It's all right. The British Library, and there are other legal deposit libraries in the UK. Sorry.
Sorry, I just thought that you used to work for Bodleian. I know that the British Library is also a copyright library.
Yeah, but you're right. The Bodleian is Trinity College, Dublin, National Library of Scotland, National Library of Wales, Cambridge. Yeah.
That's not all fallout, you know.
No, that's not fallout. What I will say is you're quite right. Some countries have got it so that their legal deposit legislation means that games are deposited. Sometimes it doesn't work out how you expect. In Japan, for 10 years they were receiving the software but not the hardware, and it's only recently that they've managed to kind of team up. They've now got a consortium, 2 universities, Nintendo, and they've got a really exciting project going on so that they can actually try and play the games. So sometimes you can change the law but not quite get what you want. And I do agree, what's happening in Germany, where it is deposited when you get your rating, seems like a wonderful, wonderful thing. What I will say in this country, at the moment they've been reviewing legal deposit legislation for e-books, and this is, if you're not in the library world, you won't know about this, but this is a saga that's been dragging on for the last few years, and each year we think, well, hey, we're going to get the new legal deposit legislation for e-books, and it keeps getting delayed by a year. And what I will say in this country is, because we're having trouble getting that passed for that, when I've spoken to my colleagues who work on the legal deposit programme, there's an unwillingness to add more into the changes that are being requested, because we're having enough difficulty getting the law changed for the kind of basics, which is a bit of a sad thing for me to say, and I obviously don't want to give this. So you're right, legal deposit is one solution, and that is what some countries are doing, but it's changing the law is not always an easy, straightforward process. So I think at the moment, what I'm looking at is what we can do at the British Library without needing a change in the law. And if we can do a lot by collaboration and cooperation and getting partners, whether in the commercial sector or public sector, to work with us, and that's brilliant. But I can say that we're not going to have a situation like Germany anytime soon.
Could I just add something slightly